First class this morning, we started with like 7 people.
Okay, so we're turning to the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act is also the major federal environmental statute by which wetlands are protected. But we're going to start by focusing more on the regulation of water pollution and the protection of bodies of water, and then turn to wetlands next week. So, in the Clean Water Act is one of the larger, more substantial federal environmental statutes. So probably the big two, if you had to sort of pick two that are really the big ones in federal environmental law, are the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. Okay? The Clean Air Act is vastly more complex and quite extensive than even the Clean Water Act. Okay, so as we go through this today, and you're like, wow, there's a lot to this, and a lot of layers, and a lot of terminology and technology and detail and so forth, just be happy that we're not covering the Clean Air Act, because it's even more so. And I don't mean to deprive you, but you will get a basic feel of the structure of a statute like this by studying the Clean Water Act. And it just is such a big time commitment in this class to do both clean water and clean air that we're just doing clean water, okay? So just be aware that there is this whole sort of thing out there about clean air. Also, clean air gets a whole lot more scientific and technical, and so that also is makes it more challenging, and we have to spend more time with it and so forth. We will touch on it when we talk about climate change, but more briefly. Okay. Whoops, sorry. So the starting point of this, Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972 in sort of the wake of the rise of U.S. environmentalism. So this is a picture of one of many Earth Day 1970 activities. So Earth Day 1970 was this huge thing nationally where all over the country there were rallies and teach-ins and demonstrations and speeches and so forth. And it reflected that what had really very quickly become this big grassroots movement promoting environmentalism. And so over time, that has morphed into other things. So these are actually U.S. stamps that sort of emphasize some of the policy values and goals behind our environmental laws. Here's a tree planting happening in West Louisville, so it shows that kind of, get involved, the kids there involved in planting the trees. And this is a protest about the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe that was protesting this and trying to stop this and so forth. This was actually, I think that's in D.C., but again, gives you sort of a feel for kind of the way in which environmentalism in the United States has been a social movement, has had a lot of sort of political dimensions, but also reflects sort of values and norms in society that have become important. So one of the things that happened actually shortly before the adoption of the Clean Water Act, and as maybe about a year before, whatever, is the National Ad Council came out with this ad, the Crying Indian ad, with an actual Iron Eyes Cody is an actual Native American who participated in this. And this is a classic. Okay, so this is, I'm showing it to you because it will help you understand. This was, it was on national television all the time. I mean, this was an ad, and it was developed as a public service. I mean, pro bono by the National Ad Council, and it is one of the best ads of all time. I mean, it's constantly, but it had a big effect. So just so that you, in the early 70s, you'll see.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it. Write for Pollution Booklet, Box 1771, Radio City Station, New York.
I don't know that probably that booklet is out there somewhere, but I don't know if that address is still good. But anyway, so you get a feel for that in the early 1970s, there was this sort of national social and cultural awareness of environmental problems and environmental issues, and people really wanted to do something about it. And one of the questions is, okay, so, all right, so don't throw your trash out your car window, right? That's obviously one of the messages there, right? There's 71 things you could do, right? And so forth. That's very personal and whatnot. But at the same time, what can the nation as a whole do to get a handle on the environmental problems, including water pollution? So a couple years before the Crying Indian ad came out, you saw this, these top two pictures on the evening news. And it's the Cuyahoga River on fire in Cleveland. Okay, now, to some degree, we can get kind of a little carried away with this as a defining event, because actually the Cuyahoga River caught fire on a regular basis. Okay? But, okay, so it's a river, right? It's a river, and it's on fire. Why? It's because of all of the pollution that was being dumped into the river, and so you get oil on the top, and then there's some sort of spark, and it catches fire. But of course, that's shocking to people, right? And so part of what happened was, while this was a relatively frequent problem, and a relatively frequent problem not only in Cleveland, but for a lot of other cities and a lot of other waterways, this was sort of very dramatic for the evening news people. And so all of a sudden, here you have the entire nation watching this, right? And saying, hey, this is bad. This is right. This is serious. And so, but you can just go around the nation and see examples. Here you've got some sort of industrial facility with the discharge, the waste from the pollution waste from the industrial facility going straight into the water, right? So pipe just, okay, and this was sort of one of the classic problems with our waterways is, industrial discharge directly into our waterways. We use our waterways as basically sinks, right? Or toilets or whatever you want to say, just to put stuff in and flush it on down the stream. Fish kills, that was another problem. A lot of dead fish, again, from pollution and whatnot. So Congress was motivated to do something, and so they passed what was called the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972, but is known more commonly by everyone as the Clean Water Act. And the purpose of the Clean Water Act, in the language of the statute itself, is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. We've previously looked at purpose sections. ESA, NEPA, they're very broad, they're very aspirational, and so forth. And as we discussed, they have almost no legal significance whatsoever, right? So for example, we've talked about the ESA. Part of its focus has to, according to the purposes section of the statute, had to do with conserving and protecting ecosystems. And what we saw is that's sort of only incidental, right? As the way that the act is really structured, it's all about species, individual organisms, wildlife and plants and so forth, and only when they're in peril of going extinct. In contrast, the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly turned to this purpose section of the Clean Water Act for actual legal meaning, for actual content for what the Clean Water Act is about and what it actually does. So here Congress commits itself to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and we're going to see that come up in U.S. Supreme Court interpretations of the Clean Water Act a number of times. So one of the things I just want to sort of point out here as a future lawyer is you have to be careful about making broad assumptions about how courts will interpret statutes, whether they will give legal effect to like purpose sections or not. I mean, it's sort of theoretically, the purpose section has no real legally operative language, and yet when it comes to the Clean Water Act, the Supreme Court has made it so. Now, the history of the Clean Water Act also emphasizes a variety of themes that we see in the class. There have been a lot of delays in implementing the Clean Water Act, so there are a variety of various goals and timetables. And I think it would be fair to say that the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters has not been fully restored even now. And so, there's been one of the things we've seen is over time, there's been a pullback from the ambitious goals of the Clean Water Act, sometimes by the EPA itself, and sometimes by Congress itself. So Congress actually ended up, as you saw in the reading, amending the Clean Water Act to basically pull back from the treatment standards it has for sewer systems. Okay? And so we'll look at that. Nonetheless, as the book points out, the Clean Water Act has had some really notable successes. Okay? Some really notable successes. We do not, for the most part, have Cuyahoga rivers catching fire these days, right? That is no longer a problem. And then, not to say that it can't happen in a very unusual or random situation, but for the most part, that's not a chronic, everyday situation like it was in the late 1960s. Okay? For the most part, our waterways are not filled with industrial toxins. Okay, so it's not going to be that you get Jack Nicholson fall in it and he comes out the Joker like he did in the Batman movie, right? You guys remember, right? The evil industrial chemical stuff that he fell in and came out in the Joker. Now, whatever. Anyway, you should go to the movies more often. So the point, though, is that in terms of a lot of our point source discharges from industry, from sewer systems, and so forth, we simply don't have the degree of pollution that we were getting by the late 60s and early 70s. On the other hand, there are a number of limits of the Clean Water Act that have become more and more the source or important for ways in which our waterways are degraded and polluted. Some of those have to do with, as the book pointed out, the fact that the Clean Water Act does not really regulate hydrological changes to waterways, such as dams, channelizing them, lining them with concrete. There's a lot of things that we do to our waterways that change the hydrology and change the natural flow, that limit the, or actually kill off or prevent aquatic life from inhabiting them and so forth. So if, for example, you go over here off of Eastern Parkway to Beargrass Creek, where Beargrass Creek crosses Eastern Parkway, where the Beargrass Creek at that point is lined with concrete, there are no fish there. Actually, there's no aquatic life because it's A, shallow, and B, it's there's nothing to support it. There's no vegetation growing in the bottom of the creek. There's no, it's too hot when it's sunny. It's too vulnerable to predators, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's basically a concrete lined channel, then that basically limits its biological contributions to aquatic life and that kind of stuff. Non-point source pollution is a major problem. Okay, so everything from runoff from urban areas to agricultural runoff, and that has become a much more significant source of pollution. And that's, of course, the topic of the problem that we're dealing with. Has to do with nutrient runoff into the Mississippi River Basin from a lot of different sources. And the Clean Water Act does not do a very good job of addressing that. Non-point source pollution is mostly exempt from the Clean Water Act's regulations or regulatory controls. Groundwater. Okay, so groundwater is not directly subject to the Clean Water Act. Groundwater may be protected where it turns out to be a source of pollution for surface water. Okay, so if you have groundwater, and groundwater is water, of course, that's underground, there's like aquifers and springs and that kind of stuff. But if it is if you pollute groundwater that then feeds into a surface water, that might fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. And so your book makes some reference to a couple of examples of that, and so that can happen. But if you're talking about just polluting the aquifer that you're getting water out of, you're pumping water out of, the Clean Water Act itself does not directly regulate that. Now we'll deal with some other statutes. It's possible that CERCLA, which is the Superfund statute, will apply to some of that and so forth. The Clean Water Act makes a half-hearted attempt at protecting watersheds as ecosystems. Okay, so watersheds are aquatic ecosystems. Watersheds are areas that drain to a common point on a body of water. So we've talked about that, about kind of how, say for example, Beargrass Creek watershed is within the Ohio River watershed, which is within Ohio River subbasin, which is within the Mississippi River Basin. And so we don't have a lot of direct protection and management of watersheds. And then, as the book points out, some of the protections of water quality that the Clean Water Act has achieved, so some of those successes up there have also come at substantial economic cost, okay, or substantial financial cost that economists question whether that's actually the most efficient way of getting those successes. Could we have done those? Could we have achieved the same result more cost effectively? And then finally, the other big theme I want to try to point out here is that there's sort of a competing narrative about the Clean Water Act. Okay, so on one hand, here you have this important federal environmental statute enacted by Congress, implemented and enforced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, aimed at protecting our nation's water. So in one level, this is a national regulatory scheme, and it is our traditional command and control, top-down regulation. But there's also parts of the Clean Water Act that emphasize that the states have a high level of responsibility, in some cases arguably primary authority for implementing the Clean Water Act. That the Clean Water Act sets certain standards and certain regulatory parameters, but within that, the states play a very substantial role. And so you might sort of think of this as sort of delegated authority, cooperative federalism. There's a variety of terms that people throw around out there, but the point is that there's a lot of parts of the Clean Water Act in which the federal government is actually not the primary actor. It's really much more the state government. And so what we're going to find with some of these provisions that you are much more likely to deal with, for example, the Kentucky Division of Water than you are with the US EPA. And so we'll talk about what some of those are. So the Clean Water Act regulates any discharge or addition of any pollutant by any person into navigable or jurisdictional waters from any point source. Okay? So this is the basic essence of the Clean Water Act. So it's discharges of pollutants by people into persons, which of course includes corporations and nonprofits and other governmental entities of various sorts. So it's really pretty much anybody who pollutes or discharges a pollutant into navigable waters from any point source. I've hedged a little here because we're going to get into which waters count as waters of the United States. What we're going to find is that the book refers to navigable waters, but what we're going to find is when we get into it, that can also include non-navigable waters that have a sufficient connection to navigable waters, and so that's why I focus more on jurisdictional waters. Jurisdictional meaning subject to federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. And we'll spend a fair amount of time with the wetland stuff talking about that. Okay, so I know this is a busy slide, but I wanted you to see it all in one place. Bless you.
Thank you.
Pollutants. The Clean Water Act, as I said, regulates discharge of pollutants, and that's really any material, okay? So if you are putting something into the water, it is generally going to be considered a pollutant, okay? And it does not have to be necessarily a bad chemical. It can be soil or sediment or fill material. It can be water that is substantially different qualities or characteristics. So it could be more acidic, or it could be hotter or colder, and that can be considered a discharge of a pollutant. We're going to get to a case where, though, if you basically put the same water back into the source, a lot of times that's not a pollutant. It's not going to be considered discharging a pollutant. So the Clean Water Act defines or establishes a process by which the EPA sets what are called effluent limits. Okay, effluent is what it is that you're putting in the water, and what are the limits of various kinds of substances. So to start with, we have to distinguish between what are called the publicly owned treatment works, POTWs, or POTWs, okay, and the POTWs are basically sewer treatment plants, okay. So you go out to the parklands of Floyd's Fork, and they've got, you're strolling along the Louisville Loop, past all the pretty forests and trees and grasslands and Floyd's Fork there, and you're wandering along, people kayaking, and right there is a big MSD sewer treatment facility discharging into Floyd's Fork. Okay? Honestly, right after a heavy rain, I would not go kayaking or swimming downstream of the sewer treatment plant in Floyd's Fork. I just wouldn't do that because It's gross. So anyway, so the idea behind the sewer treatment plants is actually we do not directly regulate the levels, the numeric levels of the stuff that's going into the waterway. Instead, what we do is we regulate the sewer treatment processes and the technology that has to be used to treat the effluent before it's discharged. Okay, so before it's discharged. And so this is, there's a primary treatment process, and it's described in more detail in your book, but this is basically mostly about getting the bigger stuff out of it. So it's the sort of removing the solids and so on and so forth. Then there's secondary treatment, which usually involves adding some sort of chemicals, disinfectant, and so on and so forth. And then there's tertiary, which is sort of even more fine-tuning. Okay. So there are sewer treatment plants that do all three, but what you see in the reading is that Congress envisioned that we would get to the point where all municipal sewage treatment facilities had at least secondary treatment, and as many as possible had tertiary treatment, and that has not happened whatsoever. Instead, eventually what happened is Congress amended the statute to pull back from the requirement of even secondary treatment. So there are plenty of sewer treatment plants that do only primary. Why? Because it's costly for these sewer treatment facilities to modify their treatments and to modify their processes and their technology and their facilities and so forth. And some of these treatment facilities are really small. Okay, so when we were out at the Parklands with Floyd's work with the environmental field study, well, we talked a little bit about what are called pocket plants. Okay, these are these little plants, treatment plants. Some of them are really just like lagoons or that kind of thing, but they serve various, they were put in when the various suburban developments were built out there, out in the East End, before the MSD sewer lines were hooked up out there. And they are notorious for failing after a certain period of time. Okay, any of you who've ever had septic systems, right? You know that you run the risk that they're just going to fail after a certain period of time. There's all sorts of reasons why that can happen. And so it's the same idea. Just think about a big septic system for an entire subdivision. Okay, and so what's been happening is MSD has been gradually eliminating those pocket plants by acquiring the service area and extending their lines and their facilities out there and so forth, because they can, they have the resources to do that and the authority to do that, but in lots of parts of the country that's not the case. Okay, so yeah.
Oh, sorry. Can BPTs consider cost?
I'm sorry?
The best practicable control technology, can that consider costs? Yeah, sorry,
Yes.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, so you're way down, Fred. So we'll get there. Okay, yeah. So yeah, yes, it is. If you right here, we should refer
It's
you.
in that chart.
If there's a table, yes, and it is on page 186, and you do cost-benefit analysis for BPT. Right, page 186. Yeah. So. A different approach to industrial sources. Okay? So industrial sources have numeric limits to various substances, and there's a whole bunch of different substances, right? So you can have numeric limits to different substances based on achievable effluent levels based on technology. Okay? So in other words, we look at the technology, but instead of requiring the technology, what we do is we use the technology to figure out what the industrial facilities can achieve, and we set the effluent levels, the numbers on the basis of that. So, only so much mercury discharged in the waterways, only so much lead discharged in the waterways, only so much sediment or soil discharged in the waterways, and so on and so forth. Paints and things what are called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. Can't say that, VOCs, and so forth. And what we see is there are a whole bunch of different approaches in the statute based on what kind, whether you have an old source or new source, and what kind of pollutant. So here we have conventional pollutants from existing sources, use BCT. Toxic pollutants from existing sources, use BAT. Non-conventional pollutants from existing sources, use BAT or BPT if they have a waiver granted. Pollutants from new point sources, use BACT. Then you have what are called PSES and PSNS. These are pretreatment standards for existing sources and new sources that are indirect. So basically what happens is in those situations, what we're talking about is what happens when some facility, some commercial or industrial facility, is putting their effluent discharge into the sewer system. Okay, so they have to treat it before they do, and so there's these pretreatment standards, and then there's a whole bunch of industry-specific effluent limitations for various categories and classes of point sources. The point here is not that you would memorize the subtle differences between BPT and BCT and BACT. I mean, right? I mean, your eyes are glazing over, right? I mean, this is like, all right, okay. But if you practice in this area at all, you need to spend lots of time knowing exactly what this is about. Okay, so lawyers who work in the Clean Water Act area throw this around, and they know exactly what they're talking about, and it's different levels. Basically, the gist is the BPT is the least demanding. So it's best just basically if there's what's the best practicable technology that's actually out there. BCT is the best conventional pollution control technology. So that is again what's out there and is conventionally used at sort of at the the BAT is best available technology, economically achievable. So best available might be more rigorous, more demanding, more costly than what is conventionally used, but is still out there and available and economically achievable. And then the BACT, best available demonstrated control technology, no consideration of costs. That is what the technology can be. In other words, this is what we call technology forcing or technology stimulating regulations. So if the technology can achieve these lower levels of pollutants and so forth, then we're going to set the levels at that those lower levels, and then what that does is it basically creates a market for those facilities to buy that technology. I mean, it basically creates a market for that technology. And so if it's been demonstrated that it can be done, then all of a sudden, there's a bunch of companies out there producing that technology for those facilities. Does that make sense? So, and of course it's costly. I mean, so if it's a new thing and it's legally required, you can imagine that whoever is producing that technology can demand quite a lot for it, because the industrial facilities have to purchase it. Okay? And not because the technology is required, but that's what the technology is needed in order to meet the effluent limits, and the effluent limits are what's required. Okay? So again, just a reminder of what the Clean Water Act does. And one of the things that's key here is distinguishing between point sources and non-point sources. Okay? So I want to call your attention to the assigned one-page handout. The thing that was in the on Blackboard. The definition of point source is any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance from which pollutants are or may be discharged. Okay? And that includes pipe, ditch, channel, tunnel, conduit, well, discrete fissure, container, rolling stock, concentrated animal feeding operation. Okay? I mentioned that the other day. So CAFOs are considered a point source. Landfill leachate collection system, vessel or floating craft. Okay, so that means your boats, your ships, your whatever. And by the way, if you are dumping something into the Ohio River from your little kayak, your little canoe, your little raft, whatever it happens to be, you right there are violating the Clean Water Act. You are a point source discharge. Okay, so there's been some cases on that. Okay, now there are cases where people go put really bad. They take something on a barge or on a fishing boat, and it's bad, really bad stuff. This like their motor oil or their some sort of chemical that they toxic chemical they've been using, and they dump it in the water. Okay, those people end up in jail. Okay, they are charged with criminal violation of Clean Water Act, and so just so you're aware. But that counts as a point source. Okay, but it excludes return flows from irrigated agriculture or agricultural stormwater runoff. So non-point is runoff for the most part. It's runoff that is running across the land, including from agricultural facilities, including from developed areas. Having said that, if your developed area has a stormwater system, sometimes called a storm sewer system, then the water then collects into the storm drains and runs through pipes and conduits and so forth, and eventually ends up in Ohio River, Beargrass Creek, Floyd's Fork, whatever. That is considered, it's called an MS4, okay, which is Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. So these are the openings in the curbs and the gutters and so forth where the water flows in, and eventually that's going to make it into our waterways, and that is because it's now going through a conduit that is owned and managed by the city, is considered now a point source. Okay, so it was non-point when it was running off of your property. Okay, it was non-point when it was running down your driveway. Non-point when it was running through the street. But once it enters the storm sewer system or the stormwater system, it is now MS4, and there's a whole set of provisions that Congress added to the Clean Water Act to require municipalities to get permits under the NPDES permits under the Clean Water Act for their MS4 systems. And originally it was, I think it was municipalities of 10,000 or more, and then it's now down to, I don't know, it's 1,000, 2,000, something like it, 2,500, something like that. Now it's a pretty small municipality that's covered. They phased it in over time. Okay? That is, by the way, different than what we call combined sewer overflows. CSOs are called combined sewer overflows. So combined sewer systems are where your stormwater system and your sewer system are connected. I mentioned this the other day in class, but just to remind you, okay, that is all of the storm sewer and sewer is the stormwater and sewer systems within pretty much all of the Waterson. If you know where Windy Hills is, that's within the Waterson, but they actually have separate systems out there because they were developed late enough that they had separate systems. But the Highlands right here around U of L, downtown, West Louisville, all that developed long enough ago that the systems were connected. And what does that mean? It means that when there's a heavy rainfall, the water pressure in the stormwater system is so great, the volume of water and the pressure of water is so great that there are only two options for that, for where that water is going to go. When it's so much, it's rained enough, there's so much water flowing into it. And those two options are up through your toilets and sinks and bathtubs, or it connects with it mixes with the sewer system, and there are valves that open, and the whole thing, including sewage, raw sewage, is discharging into waterways. Okay, so there's a bunch all over town where that's exactly what happens, and it relieves the pressure and allows it basically allows the sewer system and the stormwater system to not back up. Okay, but it means that there are discharges happening. So CSOs are a frequent subject of litigation under the Clean Water Act. So sometimes the EPA sues localities. Sometimes the state sues localities. You've probably heard that the Metropolitan Sewer District, MSD, here in Louisville, is subject to a consent decree. Okay, consent decree of what? Well, that means that the court has authorized this outcome, this judicial outcome, has entered an order, basically where the MSD and the state of Kentucky, or Commonwealth of Kentucky, and EPA have agreed that to settle MSD's history of CSOs, MSD will spend, and we're now up to $900-something million in various efforts, various mechanisms and policies and so forth to try to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff, to reduce the CSOs, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is why, if you noticed a few years ago that your water bill went up a huge amount, it is the fees that the MSD is now collecting from all of the water customers within Louisville to comply with this consent decree. And by the way, that amount keeps increasing over time. It started out as, 700 and something thousand, then it was 800 and something thousand, and so forth. And I'm sorry, not thousand, 700 million, 800 million is maybe now, I don't know, at some point I think it's going to go over $1 billion. Okay, I think is, because the cost of doing everything that MSD has said they would do is, it goes up, and also the sort of, when you enter into the consent decree, you're very optimistic that if you do, all these, 85 different things, that will make a big improvement. And then over time, what you learn is, development keeps happening, runoff keeps happening, climate change keeps happening, and what you discover is in order to prevent CSOs, you have to do more than you thought, okay? So the point here is both of these are considered point source discharges under the Clean Water Act. But if you live next to the Ohio River or the Beargrass Creek or something, your land is right there. You've got bad stuff sitting on your land. There's a big rainfall. The rain takes that stuff and deposits it directly into the Beargrass Creek or the Ohio River, so it goes washing in there, it's bad stuff, it kills the fish and so forth. Okay? You have not violated the Clean Water Act because that is runoff, it's not a point source discharge, okay? So that's one of the challenges, one of the issues here. Anybody discharging into waters of the United States is required to have an NPDES permit. This is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, and this sets a specific effluent limits that apply to that particular discharger, okay? And they're very detailed. Again, if you were in law practice, you might end up working with somebody that needs, some company usually, some entity that needs an NPDES permit, and it involves a sort of a whole process. Often states have been granted authority by the EPA to issue NPDES permits under certain conditions. So you might actually be going to the Division of Water for the Commonwealth of Kentucky for this, but the state has to follow all the standards and procedures, okay? And so any thoughts about when you apply for a permit, what the process is going to be?
Notice on the comment?
Yes, so this is going to be out there for the public is going to have an opportunity to see what your permit application is and to comment on it and to object and so on and so forth. More importantly, once your permit has been granted, this becomes, as the book points out, a highly effective enforcement tool, a highly effective system for monitoring whether various dischargers of pollutants are complying with their NPDES permits. Because two things: you have the permit, and then they have to monitor and report their discharges, including the content of those discharges. And if the discharges exceed what's allowed in the permit, it's automatically a violation, and it's known. Okay, what happens? Usually there's some sort of penalty or fine that goes with it, usually of an administrative nature as opposed to a civil or criminal nature. But obviously, at some point, if there's sort of egregiously bad behavior with bad intent, then it can lead all the way to criminal charges and so forth. And but it also means that if the EPA isn't really monitoring and enforcing these, against these violators of their permits, or the state isn't doing that, it means that a citizens group can do that, right? An environmental group can sue and say the NPDES permit has been violated, and so forth. So this is, and by the way, the citizen suit provision of the Clean Water Act allows for attorney's fees. So it is a very popular statute for litigation by environmental groups, because then when they're successful, and I mean the thing is, oftentimes it's really almost pro forma that they're successful, right? Because there's the effluent limits established by the EPA, then there's the effluent limits in the NPDES permit, and then there's the evidence provided by the polluter themselves that they violated the effluent limits, they discharged more bad stuff than is allowed, and so it's like, I mean, you can get summary judgment, right? There's no, what's the factual dispute, right? It's very obvious. They violated the NPDES permit. So a lot of times these, well, historically, what happened is that these fines and penalties went into various funds for environmental restoration activities, environmental conservation activities, and environmental education. So U of L has been a beneficiary, recipient of a number of those funds. The Center iDirect has gotten some. They have come to us from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, so they go from whatever polluter to the Commonwealth, and they get distributed and so forth. And so from time to time, we've been able to have special programming for students because we have these funds that some polluter pay to the Commonwealth, which then pay, send the money on to us to, promote environmental education and awareness and so on and so forth. There's been a real cutback, though, in recent years to those funds going to things like environmental education. I think, the money is being used for other things, and so there's not been as much towards environmental education. Yes, sir.
How significant are the fines levied for people or for entities that don't accurately report their discharge numbers? The book said they were like severe.
Yeah, can be
But-
quite severe.
Are
And
these like company ending fines or like just kind of like slap on the wrist fines?
well, it depends. Okay, it depends. So here's the thing that's kind of an odd situation is, okay, you can have large corporations that say, well, it's just too costly to comply, or we have these spillages that happens, and it's just part of a cost of business and so forth. And so it's not going to end those companies, it's not going to end their operations. But interestingly enough, my perception, and based on having actually done this in practice and also reading studies, the studies are a little bit dated. So in other words, what I'm saying, my perception is things might have changed in recent years. But the general gist is that often the very worst catastrophic sorts of discharges, pollution, catastrophes. One of these days I'll get all these words right. Okay, pollution catastrophes are actually really pretty marginal operators. Okay, you can have way more damage from some person in a neighborhood doing oil changes and dumping oil into the local waterway than you can with the big industrial facility a few blocks away. Because the big industrial facility has a lot on the line in terms of public perception, in terms of being a target, and meanwhile the person who's doing the oil changes in their backyard is like, unaware, doesn't care, doesn't value the stream quality, whatever. And so that's part of the problem. That's part of the challenge. And not just, the person changing oil in the backyard, but the sort of more marginal business operator. There's just a bigger risk that they're doing something really bad. And yes, it will end their business, but it will also mean that there's, where are we going to get the money to clean it all up, because they're pretty marginal anyway. So that's part of the challenge of all this. Is that?
Kind of. So are you saying generally that bigger companies tend to comply just because they don't want to go through the hassle and get all the bad press and everything?
They tend to not have as proportionately large a violations. Okay, so I mean, there's some of the violations just are, there's errors. I mean, there's spills that happen. There's somebody operating some sort of machinery forgets to shut a valve. I mean, it's not like somebody's intentionally saying, hey, let's put the bad stuff in the river. I mean, that does happen too, right? I'm not saying it doesn't, but there's just a certain amount of that comes with the operations. Now, of course, some people say, then they're obviously not operating the right way and so forth. But the point is that in general, larger companies are going to try to minimize that and so forth. Smaller companies that don't have the personnel, the training, the operations in place, the money to have all the equipment, they may say, hey, well, we need to operate this business anyway, so just go ahead and end up with some really pretty catastrophic events. But having said that, there are also some big things that are catastrophic. I don't want to ignore that, but just on average, that's kind of what it looks like.
Okay.
All right. So some other things that are going on with the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act requires that the states establish water quality standards for their streams and their bodies of water. So that could be rivers, streams, lakes, and so forth. And the water quality standards are based on the identified use of those waterways. So it is possible for a state to say, oh, this waterway is just purely for industrial use, so therefore it doesn't have to be particularly clean. That almost never happens, right? Even though you'd say, oh, well, maybe a state would do that so they don't have to actually demand that much. I mean, just think politically. If you said, well, we just expect the Ohio River to be toxic and polluted all the time. No, I mean, that's not politically viable, right? And so, of course, they are focused on things like fish and aquatic life. Does it support fish and aquatic life? Does it support human contact? And does it support recreational use? And does it support navigational use? Okay, so these are the four big areas: fish and aquatic life, recreational use, navigational use, and human contact. Okay, and they set these standards with possibly narrative criteria. Narrative criteria are words that describe, must be clean enough to safely allow human contact. That's a narrative standard. Okay? To support an abundance and diversity of fish species, native fish species, for example. That's a narrative criteria. Quantitative criteria are, of course, the numbers, right? They set specific numbers. It can't have more than this amount of this pollutant. It can't have more than that amount of that pollutant, and so on and so forth. Then, in order to meet the water quality standards, the state establishes what are called TMDLs, which are total maximum daily loads of various pollutants, which is basically, it says, this is the maximum amount of these kinds of pollutants that can be discharged into this body of water on a given day, and that body of water still meet the water quality standards. Okay, so this is there's going to be some discharge that can be accommodated and still meet the water quality standards. But what's the maximum? What's the total maximum that can happen on a given day? And then they're supposed to manage all the sources of those pollutants, including non-point sources, including sources that are not subject to the Clean Water Act otherwise. But remember, these are the states that are doing this, so states now have the authority to reach out and get these other polluters as well as the polluters that are subject to the Clean Water Act. Okay? So, and if a body of water does not meet the designated water quality standards, it has to be listed as impaired, and that's a specific list. So you can go and find the list of impaired bodies of water for the state of Kentucky, and it might be just certain parts, right? So it might say, from the Shelbyville Road Bridge up to the confluence of Goose Creek, and so you might get certain parts that are designated as impaired. Many of our bodies of water are impaired. Okay. Every creek or stream in Jefferson County is impaired. Okay. There's not one that's not. Okay. where there are creeks or where there are bodies of water that do not appear on the impaired list, most of the time it's simply because the state hasn't gotten around to testing and determining that it is indeed impaired. It's not that it's not that anybody feels certain that it meets the water quality standard. It's just that nobody has determined scientifically yet that it doesn't meet the water quality standards. Okay? This is again an area for litigation. Okay? So what happens is states set water quality standards and then fail to set TMDLs. Why? It's time consuming, it's costly, and once they set the TMDLs, now they have to do something about it. They have to regulate and manage and govern all these many different sources. I mean, zillions and zillions of sources of these pollutants for these bodies of water. Okay? So that's a hassle, that's a headache, and a lot of these states don't have the personnel to do that. They don't have the resources to do that, and so they don't particularly want to get speedy about setting TMDLs. Okay, so they don't. So what happens? Environmental groups sue. They say the state has a non-discretionary duty to set TMDLs. EPA has a non-discretionary duty to force the states to set TMDLs, to take enforcement actions against the states if they don't. And lo and behold, what happens is the courts say, you're right, it's exactly what the statute says, and lo and behold, the state, the EPA, is not complying. They have abused their, well, they don't have discretion. They violated, their actions are not in accordance with the law because they have failed to exercise a non-discretionary duty, and so therefore you win, and lo and behold, you get attorney's fees as well. And so again, environmental groups like to do that, and so forth. One tool that is available to both the EPA and more particularly to the states is the Section 319 program, the State Non-Point Source Management Program. This is established in the Clean Water Act, that's Section 319 of the Clean Water Act, and it basically requires states to have some sort of method or program for managing non-point sources of pollution. So basically pushes all the expectations, requirements, so forth down to the states to figure it out, but it provides funding. So a number of years ago, I received funding, my center received funding to put together a handbook called the Kentucky State Wet Growth Handbook through the Center for Land Use and Environmental Responsibility with a grant from the 319 program. It's basically about how to help communities in Kentucky figure out how to manage and regulate land use in a way to reduce water pollution and polluted water runoff and stormwater runoff and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's out there and whatnot. And so we got some money from the 319 program. The 319 program funding has been cut way back. And as your book points out, has not been unusually successful. Having said that, Kentucky has a state statute that requires farmers to have a non-point source management plan that they have to submit, and it has to meet certain criteria, and they have to submit it to the state, to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I actually think the Department of Agriculture also gets a copy of it or gets included in this process. But basically, it is a more, it actually requires more of agricultural producers than most states and more than the EPA requires. Okay, so the EPA has largely exempted agricultural runoff as a non-point source from regulation, and yet Kentucky, of all places, has a requirement that every farmer have a stormwater management plan. Now, don't get carried away. It's not this aggressive regulatory program, but it actually is more than most states have. and certainly more than the federal government requires. And it's interesting. I'm told it's sort of a happenstance of basically a compromise that got struck at the time when the politics of that made it possible. So interesting. The Clean Water Act has an anti-degradation policy, which means that it is states are prohibited from letting the quality of their waterways degrade further if they've sort of got them to a certain point, regardless of what else is required or not by the Clean Water Act. They can't allow it to degrade. And then there are a variety of watershed programs that are meant to encourage watershed planning and management. We're going to spend next class section talking about section 404 and wetlands. We're later in this class, let's see, on the 21st, we're going to talk about water quality trading and mitigation banking. We've already talked about enforcement issues and citizen suits. I just call your attention to the fact that the book refers to the challenges of regulating interstate water pollution under the Clean Water Act. And then also we're going to talk further on as this unit goes on about other sources of water quality regulation. I've already mentioned Kentucky and our statute, local governments, the Kentucky Wet Growth Handbook, Safe Drinking Water Act, Endangered Species Act. Those requirements indirectly push EPA, governments, water providers, etc., to do certain things to protect water quality so that they don't adversely affect endangered species or drinking water supplies or that kind of thing. And then we're going to talk later in the semester about watershed planning, management, and governance. So I want to end today's class with a little case study from the Florida Everglades. You see the case mentioned in the book, the Miccosukee Tribe case. So this is a picture of the Everglades. Really a lot of attention to the Florida Everglades, which are a very unique, distinctive ecosystem. It's basically a wetland system. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, I mentioned her earlier in the semester, she wrote a famous book called Everglades River of Grass. So she basically described it as this sort of ongoing sheet of water moving through these grasslands in South Florida, and brought a lot of attention to it, led to the creation of the Everglades National Park and various efforts to protect the Everglades. So, and one of the things that, and these are some pictures of the Florida Everglades. How many have been to the Everglades? A few, okay, all right, so very cool. Very distinctive, some alligators. That's the alligator eating the turtle there. What I did not include is the one where the python swallows the alligator and bursts. Has anybody, you've got, okay, give it 5 more minutes. Don't do it, don't look it up now. But it's if you like those kind of videos, it's a real video of the python eating the alligator and it bursts. Okay, dry. Okay, so the Everglades are going dry. Okay, and especially the part that is south of the Tamiami Trail, which is a road, actually to some degree south of what's called Alligator Alley, which is an interstate, but further south of that is the Tamiami Trail, goes from Tampa to Miami, and south of that is where the Everglades National Park is, and it's going dry because the historic water flows are not reaching the Everglades, okay, because we have all of these flood management systems that are meant to protect and provide water for sugarcane fields and agricultural activities, to protect all the land development. So Anybody has ever been to anywhere from Palm Beach to Miami, it is one continuous big land development right down the east coast of South Florida, and so forth. And so with that, we have all these water diversions and pumps and reservoirs and so on and so forth, and it's depriving the Everglades of the natural flow of water. And so you see this 1947 publication. It was put out, report about a flood that happened in Florida, and this is the famous weeping cow or crying cow report. Okay, so this picture of the cow crying as it gets swept away by the flood. And again, it sort of captured people's imagination and said, oh my gosh, we've got to stop this flooding from happening, and so we've got to prevent the water flow through the Everglades and so on and so forth. And this is one of the stations that pumps, and it's got, it's kind of dammed this up and holds the water back and so forth. You see land development around and so forth. Okay, so and there's more land development. You get the idea, right? Okay, so this all wetland. It's land and water all together, and you can imagine how people's homes can flood from that and so forth. And if you, okay, I know this dates me, and I won't play the YouTube video, but John Anderson, country music star, had a famous song, Seminole Wind. I encourage you to play it, the video or whatever. Okay, so there's an Everglades, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CURP, is designed to try to restore some flows. Now, it's not, they say restore the historic flows. It's actually not true, and for a couple of reasons. One is you can't, given how much everything's changed, you can't simply just let the water flow the way it did, 50 years or 100 years ago. Okay, it's not gonna happen. Okay, there's too many other things in the way now, and so on and so forth. In addition, the ecology of the Everglades have changed. We've deprived it of its natural flow for so many decades that the soils have changed, the elevations have changed, some of the vegetation has changed, and so you can't just put it back. But people are very nostalgic. They read Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's book, and they think, hey, we can put the Everglades back to the way it was in the 1930s. It's never going to happen like that, and so this is in part, again, something the public gets all excited about, and yet at the same time they're misunderstanding what's really going on here. But the idea is to restore some of the natural flow. So that's the historic flow. This is the current flow. You see, right, we're not getting much water there. From that, the big thing in the middle is Lake Okeechobee. Okay? And then and this is the plan to get some, not all the way from Lake Okeechobee, but to get some flows going back to the Everglades National Park. Okay? So South Florida Water Management District versus Miccosukee Tribe Indians. Federal U.S. Supreme Court case decided in 2004, and the Miccosukee Tribe sued the South Florida Water Management District, Regional Water Management District, that is supposed to be implementing CURP, this restoration plan, because they said when they transfer the water from these basins that are holding the water that has sort of run off from all these fields and developments, and they pump it over a berm into the Everglades National Park, and the land that belongs to the Miccosukee Tribe, that water is polluted. It has nutrients in it, and that is a discharge of a pollutant in the waters of the United States, and they don't have an NPDES permit to do that. And so that's so Broward County, you've heard about them from the, hanging chads and so on and so forth, right? 104 square miles, goes into Canal C11, then pump S9 and into this wetland area. And the Miccosukee Tribe sues, and these are pump stations, this is the area, and So they use the Clean Water Act, and the question is this a discharge, or is this really one body of water and you're just moving it from one part to the next? The Supreme Court basically says, well, this is a factual issue. Are the canal and wetland meaningfully distinct water bodies, or is it just you're taking water, from the soup bowl and putting it back in the soup bowl? That's the basic, question. Are they distinct, or is it really the same body of water? And the EPA says, hey, all waters are unitary, right? And so moving water from one body of water to another should not require an NPDES permit. And the Supreme Court says, well, if they're meaningfully distinct bodies of water, it does. If they're not, that's fine. And so they send it back. Typical thing we see, I'm going to give you a couple more minutes, then we'll be done with this. They send it back to the EPA, reverse remand, figure it out. The EPA ultimately adopts a rule that is the unitary waters rule. Basically says, if you're moving water from one body to another without it going through any sort of sewer system or water system, you're just you're just pumping it from one body to another, that is just moving it within the same unitary body of water, and you do not have to have an NPDES permit. Okay? So that's the NPDES water transfers rule, and that we'll talk about this, the last part about LA at the beginning of class next week, and then we'll go into wetlands. Okay?
I can finally go home and crawl into a blanket.
Oh, that sounds great.
So excited.